Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. Today, I'm going to review a classic issue of X-Men, X-Men number 251. Now, I could talk about this book for hours. This is the height of the X-Men in the 1990s. But the reason why I chose this book specifically was because I did my review of X-Men number 143 to look at a one-shot issue where Chris Claremont was dealing with the X-Men and how that early book of X-Men actually compared to what we have today, and how his somewhat early style captured the audience and made sure that everybody was included who wanted to read this book. And so I wanted to look at a later X-Men done by Chris Claremont, and when I started to think about one-shots, this, number 251, was the one that instantly came to my mind. Now, first off, I just want to point out, I'm talking about two separate books written by Chris Claremont in a series of comics that he was almost continually writing. And this is over 100 issues away. Can you even imagine a comic writer in today's market putting that much devotion into a book, working on it for more than 100 issues at a time? Now, I want to talk about the story itself for a little bit. So what I'm going to do right now, to begin with, is just talk about Chris Claremont's style and how it changed over those 100 issues that he was writing. Because when I did that other review of X-Men number 143, like I said, this was a book that was generated and looks to be for everybody. This was trying to draw in an entire generation as an audience, and it made sure that no one was excluded, and everyone could, with the story, jump onto this issue and not get lost with what is going on. But when you look at number 251, this is when you see a bit of a paradox, because here you have comics when they are in their height, certainly when the X-Men comics were at their zenith. And yet you can tell by Chris Claremont's style and how he puts this book together that he is dealing with a very specific audience. This book isn't quite for everyone. This book is for people who love X-Men, who know the X-Men mythology, and know exactly what is going on with the story arcs that Chris Claremont has been covering for the last 20 issues almost. And when I started to think about this issue, I thought for a second, this was Chris Claremont getting a little bit lazy, because you can actually see within his writing him using tropes that he has used before, that he has created over those 100 issues. You know, like the fact that in story you have characters calling Wolverine the best at what he does. But I don't think that's the case. I think that Chris Claremont had to make sure that he was dealing with his audience because he knew who his audience was. And again, originally when he started, that audience was so large and tried to encompass so many people and to draw in so many people that he had to make sure that his story was open to everyone so that everyone could get into it. But no, this story is very specifically for those people who love the X-Men, and he knows will buy this issue. Looking back on this, I would say his earlier style was the superior style, but I gotta say, when I was reading this fresh off the shelf, this was the best thing that came off the shelf for months around this book. This is a snapshot of excitement from the past. And it drew into its story so many different threads of not only X-Men lore and X-Men story and Chris Claremont writing, but Marvel lore and Marvel story writing as well. Because first of all, you have Chris Claremont bringing a huge story arc to an end. This version of the X-Men in this book is the last time that they are together. But this storyline doesn't peter out. He makes sure that it ends with a bang. And at the same time, he hooks his entire audience to continue on to the next story arc. Another thread that's pulled into this is the fact that this is the first time Wolverine meets Jubilee. And this is the core of where their relationship actually begins. And on top of all of that, this entire story harkens back to an older Conan story that it is based upon. It is Conan on the Cross, which was a classic Conan story from the very early days when I had comics. I didn't actually have that issue, I really wish I did, but I had the Treasury edition of the Conan on the Cross issue. Those are those huge oversized comics that they used to make. So, as I said, this story just draws in so many threads and ties them together almost seamlessly. But I guess I should really give you a summary of the story. If I'm doing a review, how many minutes have I talked now without giving you a summary of the story? I'm sure most of you already love and enjoy this story, but I'll give you a summary anyways. The Reavers mean to break Wolverine once and for all. Each of them have felt his claws tear into their flesh. Each of them have learned the hard way to fear his rage. But together, they've trapped him and nailed that rage to a cross. Under the scorching heat of the desert, Wolverine's mind starts to shut down. And only the berserker, buried deep within, can save him now. Okay, so after reading my own summary for that book, it makes me think that this is one of the other threads that ties into this story. You have Chris Claremont, and he was trying to take Wolverine and to civilize him through some of his books, because in the early books he was really ferocious, and he made sure that people knew that. But there was a bit of a civilization of Wolverine through the books that were prior to this one, where Wolverine was actually the leader of the X-Men. And in this story, Wolverine, in order to survive, needs to discard that. He needs to make sure that he brings the berserker back out. So, to some extent, this is a rejuvenation of Wolverine himself. But there's one other part of this story that I really want to zoom right in on, and it's a few panels of dialogue that Havoc has in this book. And I want to just highlight that in order to show you how much of a contrast we have between this book, which is at the height of the X-Men popularity, and what we have today. Because today, we have Havoc in one of the X books. It's the Hellions, and I've covered this book. And the reason why he's lumped in with all of these villains within the Hellions is because he tries to kill humans. Because if you know anything about Havoc's power, well, it's in his name. It's destructive, and he's using it full out on human beings, in a way to almost torture them. Because, of course, he lives in Krakoa, and this is a mutant supremacist, isolationist society which promotes an almost fervent hate for human beings. By the way, if you're not following any of the current X-Men books, what I have just described is not a hideout for villains. It is the way that the X-Men themselves live right now, and it is built by Professor Xavier, and it is the way that the current people who run Marvel think that the mutant dream should actually be lived out. And not only that within the story, but I covered in another video how the people who work at Marvel actually hate people who are in the history of the X-Men, like Professor X, saying that he was poking around in children's minds because he got off on it and he liked to see children fight each other. But this book, reading a couple of panels of dialogue from Havoc in this book, just annihilates everything that is being told to you in those stories today and by those people who work for Marvel today. Because within the story itself, what you have is the X-Men who are beaten and battered, and they're returning to their desert home, and Psylocke picks up on the fact that the Reavers are waiting for them to ambush them, and she knows they're in no condition to take them on. So what she does is, she gets into their minds, and she prompts them, each of them, to do what they always wanted to do. That is, to be selfish just for one moment. So they'll all give up on the X-Men, and they will go through the Siege Perilous, which will allow them to begin their lives anew. So, in order to save their lives, she's mentally pushing them in the direction that they want to go anyways. But they haven't gone in that direction because of their duty towards the X-Men. And the funny thing that, right in this story, we have Havoc, and he's saying that Betsy's poking around in his mind, and it's making him a little bit uneasy. He never felt uneasy like that with Charles Xavier. Which again completely obliterates those idiotic statements that the people from Marvel were making about the fact that Professor X likes to play around in the minds of children. And Havoc is the one who is resisting most this push from Betsy to give up. He feels like he's betraying the dream of Charles Xavier. And even though what he said, as he says within one of these panels, comes straight from his heart, again, he doesn't want to give up on that duty. And I'm going to read you a couple of word balloons that Havoc says, just to show you how ridiculous the current X-Men storyline is. This is what Havoc says. How can we call ourselves a team anymore? Just the four of us left, living out in the middle of nowhere. What good are we to anyone? How does this further Professor Xavier's dream? Remember, the one that brought us all together? Of a better world where mutants and humans can live together in peace. Listen to me, mutant and human, as though being the one precluded the other. It's like we perpetuate the prejudice even as we try to fight it. Again, this completely obliterates the entire storyline that you have today with the X-Men. And it's coming from a character who right now is being lumped in with villains because he hates humans so much. And here at the zenith of the storytelling for Marvel, certainly the zenith of the storytelling for the X-Men, what do we have? We have the same character saying, we can't just go off and hide. What good is that? Staying out here in the middle of nowhere? We can't do any good doing that. But what do you have today? They're off hiding on their little island. And what does Havoc go on to say? He says, we need to further the dream of Professor Xavier, having mutants and humans live together in peace. And even then, he says, listen to me, saying mutant and human like they're two different things. And he berates himself for even putting them in the sentence like that, because being mutants means they are human. And yet, what do we have today? We have these same characters berating anyone who is a human and the ideas of humans themselves, or even the idea of being human. They discard it like it was a piece of garbage. But just as I did my last video on how history controls what you do in the present, this is the history of the X-Men that completely obliterates that entire storyline that we see today. Because this issue and these kinds of stories back in number 251, this is a picture of heroes. And it will always overshadow what we see in the X-Men books today. So, as I say, make comics better by reading better comics. And this is quite certainly a better comic. Alright, I'll see you later. Bye.